everyone. Today we are going to be talking about the conspiracy of Tchaikovsky's death, including the official version that he died of cholera and the rather suspicious circumstances that led people to seek alternate explanations. We will then look at each of those theories and the evidence for and against them. I'm just going to say right now that there is no definitive answer as to which story is true, because the smaller details that could sway the argument in favor of one side or another are still debated. So the whole thing remains somewhat of an unsolved mystery. So just take everything I say in here with a giant allegedly. Content warning for Unalive. I can't say the actual word because I don't want this video to be removed, but that is one of the major theories. Also, I have created a Ko-fi page, so if you enjoy my content and would like to leave a small donation, link is in the description. But without further ado, I hope you enjoy the video and thank you for watching. So the official explanation for Tchaikovsky's death is that he died of cholera after drinking unboiled water during a cholera pandemic. Where he got this unboiled water is already a point of debate. According to Tchaikovsky's brother Modeste, on November 2nd, 1893, Tchaikovsky was staying at Modeste's apartment and woke up with a stomachache. However, Modeste wasn't too worried, as Tchaikovsky often had stomach issues. When Modeste offered to call a doctor, Tchaikovsky refused, but again, this wasn't too unusual because Tchaikovsky generally disliked seeing doctors. Then during lunch at the apartment, Tchaikovsky drank a glass of unboiled water. And this time Modeste was worried, but Tchaikovsky said that he wasn't afraid of cholera. Later that day, Modeste finally called a doctor who diagnosed Tchaikovsky with cholera. Tchaikovsky's condition began rapidly deteriorating. He said, "I believe this is death." However, he also tried to be very courageous and maintain a sense of humor. His condition briefly improved, but then he relapsed and began to lose hope in his survival. After a few days of attempting treatment to no avail, the doctors finally tried the one treatment that was then considered effective, which was soaking in a warm bath. The reason they had hesitated was that when Tchaikovsky was a kid, his mother had died of cholera while undergoing the same treatment, and so now he had a phobia of it. However, Tchaikovsky's condition got much worse. His kidneys failed, he became unconscious, and he died in the early morning of November 6th, 1893. In a different version of the story, according to one of Tchaikovsky's nephews, he drank the unboiled water at a restaurant called Liner's on November 1st, the day before Modeste said he drank the water. According to this version, Tchaikovsky had ordered some water. The waiter told him that they had run out of boiled water, and so Tchaikovsky asked for unboiled water, which the waiter brought him. His friends tried to convince him that this was a dumb idea, but Tchaikovsky ignored them and drank it anyway, and from there the rest of the story is the same. So this official version began to raise questions almost immediately after Tchaikovsky's death, and here is where we will get into some of the criticisms of the story. First is the suspicious circumstances after Tchaikovsky's death. Even though cholera was highly contagious, Modeste's apartment was open to visitors, and Tchaikovsky's body was in an open casket. There was even one drunk cellist who kept kissing Tchaikovsky's face. A possible explanation for this is that a few months before Tchaikovsky's death, health officials had determined that cholera wasn't nearly as contagious as they had originally thought, and so by the time of Tchaikovsky's death, they had already changed the closed casket rule. Also, Tchaikovsky's family took care to continually disinfect Tchaikovsky's face, so that drunk cellist was good to go. The second criticism / point of debate is, why was Tchaikovsky so reckless with drinking unboiled water during a cholera pandemic? It's true that at the time, even though cholera affected all social classes, it was mostly seen as a disease of the lower class, who lived in more crowded conditions and often weren't able to boil their water. So Tchaikovsky, as part of the upper class, might have thought that he didn't need to worry. However, if you'll remember, Tchaikovsky's mother had died of cholera, and that had been one of the most traumatizing experiences of his childhood. Even weirder is that he drank unboiled water quite often, while in most other aspects of personal hygiene he was very careful. Next is the discrepancy of where he drank the unboiled water, at Modeste's apartment or at the restaurant. According to Modeste, at the restaurant, Tchaikovsky had eaten macaroni with white wine and soda water, but no unboiled water. Tchaikovsky's nephew, who told the restaurant version, wasn't even at the restaurant when Tchaikovsky supposedly drank the unboiled water, but he told the story as if he had actually witnessed it, which Alright, but if we do go with the restaurant version just for a minute, why would there be unboiled water when all restaurants had been required to boil their water? Well, it turns out that many restaurants disregarded the official rule, and they often mixed boiled water with cold unboiled water to cool it faster, which is disturbing to say the least. And if the unboiled water was instead at Modeste's apartment, why would he have unboiled water sitting at his table? I don't know. Boil your water, Modeste. Another point of suspicion is the discrepancies in the medical reports that were published after Tchaikovsky's death. One of the doctors at Tchaikovsky's bedside had written an article on his symptoms in order to dispel the many rumors that had been popping up, and Modeste had also recorded Tchaikovsky's symptoms in explicit detail to support the doctor's article. However, this actually kind of backfired because Modeste and the doctor couldn't agree on the exact symptoms or even the date of death. Their information also conflicted with the medical bulletins that were posted outside Tchaikovsky's door. The fact that Modeste went into much more graphic detail than is necessary for the average reader has also been interpreted as him trying too hard to promote the cholera story as a cover-up for something else. One hypothesis is that Tchaikovsky had been poisoned and hadn't actually shown any cholera symptoms, and that Modeste and the doctor had taken their so-called reports straight out of a medical textbook. The last thing that seems kind of off is that neither of the head doctors was very experienced with cholera, but they hadn't consulted another doctor for help, and neither of them was present at the time of Tchaikovsky's death. They actually received a lot of backlash for this, with people saying that they had wanted Tchaikovsky to die and so hadn't given him the best treatment. However, more recently, a microbiologist went and investigated the medical side of things and said that the doctors had done everything in their power and had actually cured the cholera, and that Tchaikovsky had finally died of non-contagious complications of cholera, which would also help to explain why so many people were allowed into his room after his death. So now that we've sort of dissected the official story, let's move on to the theories, starting with the court of honor and self-unalive theory. This one states that Tchaikovsky had been paying some unwanted attention to the son of a certain duke, and the duke wrote a letter condemning Tchaikovsky and gave it to a guy named Nikolai Jacobi to deliver to the Tsar of Russia. Jacobi had been one of Tchaikovsky's classmates at his old law school, because yes, Tchaikovsky went to law school, and he realized that if the letter were delivered to the Tsar and the scandal were made public, Tchaikovsky probably would have lost all his rights and been exiled to Siberia, according to the laws about homosexuality at the time. A public scandal also would have ruined Tchaikovsky's reputation and dishonored the school that they had both gone to. So Jacobi decided that he was going to get a bunch of Tchaikovsky's old classmates together and form a secret court of honor to quietly settle Tchaikovsky's fate. At the court of honor, there were 8 people in total, including Tchaikovsky, and they spent about 5 hours discussing, whispering, yelling at each other, and eventually Tchaikovsky rushed out of the room looking very pale. Apparently the court had decided that Tchaikovsky needed to unalive himself, which I guess they thought was better than shame and exile, and according to the theory, Tchaikovsky died either by purposely drinking unboiled water and getting cholera, or by taking a poison that had symptoms resembling cholera, so it would look like he had died of natural causes. Now, the strengths of this theory are that it patches up a few holes in the official story. In Modeste's biography of Tchaikovsky, there is a detailed account of Tchaikovsky's last days, except for the morning and afternoon of October 31st, 1893, about a week before Tchaikovsky's death. According to this theory, Modeste didn't keep a record of that day because Tchaikovsky was at the secret court of honor. Now you're probably wondering, if it was supposed to be secret, then how do we know about it today? And here is where the theory gets a lot of criticism because the source of the information is rather dubious. The theory was made public in 1979, almost 90 years after Tchaikovsky's death, by Russian musicologist Alexandra Orlova. She had heard the story from Alexander Voitrov, who had gone to the same law school as Tchaikovsky and Jacobi, the guy who had convened the court of honor, and over the years he had been collecting information about the people who had gone to the school. You know, a regular hobby. Voitrov had heard the story from Jacobi's widow, Elizaveta Karlovna, who at the time of the court had been in the next room listening in. She had been sworn to secrecy, but since she was getting older, she decided to tell her story to Voitrov so it wouldn't be lost with her. And so Karlovna told the story to Voitrov, who told it to Orlova, who made it public. So that's the first major problem with this theory, is that the information was heard from several steps away, many decades after it supposedly happened. The second issue is the idea of the, quote, homosexual scandal, and Tchaikovsky trying to seduce a duke's nephew. It's actually unclear whether the duke was offended because Tchaikovsky was a dude, the fact that he was much older than the nephew, or because someone, didn't matter who, was trying to seduce the nephew. Most biographers have sort of assumed that the duke had a problem with Tchaikovsky being gay, and that's why he wrote a letter to the tsar, etc., etc. And since this part is kind of glossed over, for now we'll just have to run with it and look at how society at the time viewed homosexuality. In Russia, homosexuality had been criminalized in 1832 and could be punishable by being exiled to Siberia and having all your rights taken away. However, this law was, quote, virtually never enforced among the upper classes, as they were surprisingly tolerant. In fact, in major cities, there was a kind of visible subculture with a relatively high number of openly gay and bisexual couples. And Tchaikovsky's sexual orientation was kind of an open secret. People weren't supposed to know, but many of them did anyway. The ruling imperial family was also relatively tolerant, so even if the Tsar had received the Duke's letter, he probably wouldn't have made that big of a scandal over it. This is not to say that the general public was as tolerant or accepting. In fact, many people still viewed homosexuality as a sin or immoral, and in scientific literature, it was still considered a disorder. But the point is that there was a lot more tolerance of the LGBTQ community than we might expect from that time period. For the part about how Tchaikovsky's homosexuality would have, quote, dishonored his old school, apparently the school also had its own relatively visible gay subculture. The students also wrote a song about pederasty, or relationships between boys and older men, which doesn't sound like they were trying very hard to keep an uptight reputation either. Now, a variation of the forced unalive theory is that Tchaikovsky was chasing after somebody, but this time was forced to unalive by the Tsar himself. The main criticism against this theory is that the Tsar thought very highly of Tchaikovsky. In fact, he had given him official honors and a lifetime pension, and after Tchaikovsky's death had paid for his elaborate funeral, something that was extremely rare among artists. It's also speculated that the Tsar knew that Tchaikovsky was gay, but was relatively tolerant and wouldn't have gone so far as ordering him to unalive himself. The next theory is that Tchaikovsky still unalived himself, but it was of his own intent, meaning he had been struggling with a lot of personal issues and purposely drank unboiled water to contract cholera in order to look like he had died of natural causes. This theory popped up almost immediately after his death, and it was largely due to the fact that his tragic Sixth Symphony had premiered only 9 days before his death. It's very interesting that at the premiere, audiences weren't all that emotionally impacted by the piece. Instead, there was a sort of polite bewilderment at why the piece ended on such a slow, depressing movement instead of the usual triumphant finale. However, at the second performance, 3 weeks after Tchaikovsky's death, the emotional response was very different, as people began to connect the symphony with Tchaikovsky's death and see the piece as an unalive note. Now, here is where things get really interesting in trying to decode the Sixth Symphony. Tchaikovsky had said that there was a program or story behind the piece, but he didn't say what that story was, except for hinting that it was autobiographical. The piece is subtitled Pateticheskaya in Russian and Pathétique in French, which translates to passionate and emotional. We know that when he was writing it, he often got very sad. In the first movement, he quotes the Russian Orthodox Mass for the Dead. When one of his friends asked him to write a requiem in honor of another friend, Tchaikovsky said that the new requiem would be redundant and sound too similar to the Sixth Symphony. And actually, at one rehearsal of the symphony, that same friend got so emotional that he said, "What have you done? It's a requiem, a requiem." Tchaikovsky also believed that it was the, quote, best and most sincere of his works. So, putting all the pieces together, the utter sadness at the symphony's ending might be a sincere expression of Tchaikovsky's own hopelessness towards life. And according to the theory, the reason for Tchaikovsky's hopelessness was either his unrequited love for his nephew, his lack of acceptance in society because of his homosexuality, or his recurring and untreated depression, or some combination. Let's look at the nephew issue first. Tchaikovsky's relationship with Vladimir Davudov, or Bob as he called him, was rather complicated. As a kid, Bob had been Tchaikovsky's favorite nephew. As Bob got older, Tchaikovsky saw him as someone who he could confide in emotionally, since his previous confidant had ghosted him after 13 years of friendship. But Tchaikovsky also viewed Bob in more romantic terms. As in his letters to Bob, he would make literary references to romantic relationships, and he would express his desire to be constantly near him. Bob was gay, but he wasn't in love with Tchaikovsky. He had a crush on one of his classmates who Tchaikovsky got very jealous of. The Sixth Symphony is also dedicated to Bob. The other possible reason for his unaliving, as given by the theory, was Tchaikovsky's struggle to accept his sexual orientation in general. And here it gets more complicated, because while it's generally agreed that Tchaikovsky was gay, it is widely debated whether or not he accepted this part of himself. In his letters to the few people that he was out to, he wrote that it made him feel isolated and unsociable towards other people. For example, he wrote, "My rendezvous has been arranged for this evening. Truly bittersweet dilemma. Finally, I decided to go. I spent 2 absolutely wonderful hours in the most romantic circumstances. I was scared, I was thrilled, I was afraid of the slightest sound." It seems that for the first 30 or so years of his life, he believed that he could change his sexuality whenever he wanted to, and marry a woman as his family pressured him to do. And so, in 1877, in order to make his relatives happy and to squash rumors of his homosexuality, Tchaikovsky married one of his former students, Antonina Milyakova. Now, Antonina was infatuated with Tchaikovsky, but Tchaikovsky had only married her because he needed to marry someone, and she was just the first opportunity to show up. So, as you can expect, their marriage was not good, to say the least. They only lived together for like 5 weeks before Tchaikovsky left. Side tangent, contrary to popular belief, it was not entirely Antonina's fault. Apparently, she was a very kind person who just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. Either way, the failure of the marriage made Tchaikovsky realize that he couldn't just change his sexual orientation as he had originally believed, and he began saying that his inclination, as he so called it, was his biggest obstacle to happiness. The disastrous marriage also caused him to allegedly attempt to unalive himself by wading into a freezing river and trying to contract pneumonia. I say allegedly because there is only one original source that states this. But if the story is true, it makes it more probable that he would again attempt to unalive himself because of another major crisis involving his sexuality/romantic life. And finally, according to some musicologists, the themes and harmonies in the Sixth Symphony represent a sort of forbidden love, as in homosexuality, because even though the upper classes might have been relatively tolerant, it is unlikely that Tchaikovsky was completely insulated from the prejudices of the general public. Another point of debate in the unalive theory is whether Tchaikovsky was happy during the few months leading up to his death. According to Modest's biography, Tchaikovsky had seemed to be in good spirits and was making plans for the future. Other historians have said that no, Tchaikovsky was generally unhappy, with a hectic concert schedule, lots of anxiety-inducing social events, poor health, and the deaths of many of his close friends. And they say that Modest was trying too hard to make it sound like Tchaikovsky was happy in order to discredit the unalive theory. In Tchaikovsky's letters during the last few years of his life, he often referenced his depression. For example, "Something is happening inside me which I don't understand. Some sort of weariness from life, a sense of disappointment. It's something hopeless, final. And also, I'm suffering from a melancholy for which there is no word. There's a place in my new symphony where I think it is well expressed. Another thing is that not everyone sees the Sixth Symphony as an unalive note, and they interpret the slow final movement as Tchaikovsky just experimenting with form and seeing if he could defy the traditional symphonic structure. The ending could also represent not a personal requiem, but instead the inevitability of death for all of humanity. And now onto some theories that deserve an honorable mention, starting with cholera from other sources, as in doing it in the less than hygienic conditions of the day, because cholera spreads in addition to via food and water through human waste. And then we have the death from natural causes theory, which says that Tchaikovsky's death was caused by a number of factors, like the constant stress of touring and conducting concerts, his consumption of alcohol, his smoking, his poor diet, and frequent stomach diseases. So it's possible that he knew he was nearing the end of his life, and the Sixth Symphony is an expression of that inevitability. So, after all that, do we know what Tchaikovsky died of? No, we don't, at least for now. Imagine we finally find some conclusive evidence after more than a century of heated debate, and it's like, oh yeah, he didn't eat enough vegetables or something. But yeah, sorry to leave you with such an unsatisfying conclusion, but I guess the main thing that we can get out of this is that Tchaikovsky's death was a lot more complicated than it seems. And so with that, I hope you enjoyed and learned something interesting. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all next time. Bye. One of the craziest things I found while reading about this whole thing is that when Tchaikovsky was a student, he had a crush on a classmate named Vladimir Gerard, but his love went unrequited, and it was this experience that actually inspired a lot of his later music, including the Romeo and Juliet overture. And according to the Court of Honor theory, one of the people who had been summoned to sentence Tchaikovsky to death was Vladimir Gerard. Like, ouch.